from that point on, Lewis became a ferocious Indian fighter. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. In this week's video, we're going to once again hop in our time machine and talk about a legendary figure on the American frontier. Lewis Wetzel was born in 1763 in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. This was a very pivotal time in American history, and especially around the Ohio River Valley. The Wetzel family relocated to what is now the panhandle of West Virginia, around a place called Fort Henry, that is now Wheeling, West Virginia. Lewis was born to an indentured German servant named John Wetzel, and his mother was a Flemish Huguenot named Bonnie. Of course, that Huguenot basically is rooted in the Calvinist religion. By the time that Lewis was born, the French and Indian War had concluded. However, nothing on the frontier was settled as it was supposed to be. Whites were not permitted to settle west of the Appalachian Mountains, but everybody knows they did. They encroached upon the Indians that lived there daily, setting up farms and homesteads, which is exactly what the Wetzels and a handful of other families did. This automatically meant that they were a target for Indian raids, and they often were. These bloody but short and violent raids saw their family members kidnapped and at times murdered in their sleep. It was during one of these raids when Lewis and his brother were taken captive. They were led away from the farm for 2 days, and Lewis was actually wounded during that raid, very slightly across his chest. After 2 days of captivity, Lewis and his brother escaped, but in one of the first instances of Lewis proving what an amazing character he would turn out to be, he snuck back into the Indian camp to grab their shoes because they knew they wouldn't make it back home to Fort Henry without them, all at the ripe old age of 13. It is unclear where exactly Lewis's hatred for the red man came from. It might have been the first time he was taken in captivity, or it could have been when he was in his early 20s. He and 2 brothers, as well as their father, were canoeing, trapping, and hunting along the Ohio River when they came across some tribesmen. Lewis's father and one of his brothers were killed, and Lewis and his brother Martin made it back to Wheeling. What is known, though, however, is from that point on, Lewis became a ferocious Indian fighter. In fact, he would hunt them for sport. No lie, hunt them for sport. Lewis spent most of his 20s and 30s as an Indian scout for the military. That was an interesting job because you weren't paid. Oftentimes you weren't even supplied your own weapons. Your job was to go out and keep your eye on the Indians, so to speak, so the military knew where to find them. Once located, what would typically happen is an Army general, in one case called Harmar, sometimes called the Crawford Expedition, these military people would get a militia together and go out and try to eradicate some Indian tribes. Oftentimes, these expeditions were ill-fated, especially during that period of time. The American frontier, and particularly the American military, if that's what you want to call it, more like a colonial militia, was trained in the English square. They really didn't understand guerrilla fighting and were oftentimes absolute fodder for the Native American tribes. Oftentimes, the only people to return from those ill-fated expeditions were actually the scouts, because they were totally ingrained into frontier custom and war fighting. These people operated almost completely independently of the military once the fighting started. They were lone, solitary figures, and even when signed up in the militia, they were not suited for military service. Way too much regimentation. Imagine being in the colonial militia and you're Lewis Wetzel. By the time you're 17 years old, you're almost 6 feet tall, and you've never cut your hair. Your raven black hair hangs past your thighs when it's fully combed out. He would typically wear it up in a ponytail, and even though he hated Native Americans, he himself had taken so many scalps, he believed that by leaving his hair long, it would be a suitable trophy for the brave that finally took his scalp, which, as we now know, never happened. In fact, he got so good as an Indian fighter that the Indians began to call him the Death Wind, largely because of a skill set that he had been working and perfecting since he was a kid, which was the ability on a dead run to load a flintlock rifle and actually use it with accuracy. The story goes that while running, Lewis would keep smaller diameter lead balls in his mouth than the caliber of his rifle called for. He could pour powder from the horn while on a dead run, and supposedly would slam the butt of the gun on the ground to pack the powder, spit the ball out, run it down, and then turn and fire. There are eyewitness accounts of him doing this, believe it or not, and there are many letters to substantiate that amazing skill set. Believe it or not, one day while being chased by 4 Stone Age mines across an open field, Lewis used that skill set and murdered 3, and the 4th ran off, muttering something to himself about how his rifle is always loaded, which was also a moniker that they would hang on another famous Ohioan, Simon Kenton. And these two, in fact, did know one another. This is a .50 caliber flintlock rifle. Of course, it has way more modern sighting systems than the one that Wetzel would have had used for on the frontier, but it's very similar. Of course, you have your locking system here, double set triggers. I always love the shape of these rifles. They're just completely works of art to me, very beautiful. And of course, octagonal barrel, you know, just a typical normal sort of shooter, but there's something always cool about flintlocks, and I could not imagine, if you ever tried it and you own a flintlock, try to load one of these while you're walking. Now imagine, try to do it while you're sprinting, and more importantly, sprinting away from 4 people that are intent on taking your head. Quite an amazing trick. During the American Revolution, the British government encouraged the Indians all over the frontier to rise up against their white colonists. That, coupled with just the times of whites encroaching upon Indian territory, made what had been a violent encounter something even more catastrophic to the Indian population. They were hunted and killed at will, usually led by people like Lewis Wetzel. Accounts vary, but we know for a fact that Lewis actually killed 37 different Indians along the way, and some put the number at closer to triple digits. I guess we'll never know, but I can rest assured it was a lot. Right around 1800 or so, Lewis relocated to the Louisiana Territory. The Indian wars along the Ohio frontier were dying down, and he went there to visit some relation of his. While there, he was incarcerated for 2 years for a counterfeiting operation. The interesting thing is, however, Lewis probably didn't even know that he had counterfeit bills. He struggled to read and write, and he would have really no use for a whole lot of money. You see, they believed back then in the barter system and used it pretty heavily. So what's likely happened was Lewis became in contact or had possession of counterfeit bills, spent them somewhere, got caught, and did a couple of years in prison. When he was released, he went back to the Ohio Territory. He never married, and he never had any children. Right around 1808, Lewis returned to the Louisiana Territory to visit his family. During that period of time, he had gotten yellow fever and was on his deathbed. He began to record some letters that he wished to be sent back home to his family. And one of the interesting things about Lewis is even on his deathbed, he was an unrepentant hatred and murderer of Indians. He actually stated that he was prepared to die because the Indians back home were peaceful, and he was too old to go out and fight the fierce ones out west. And that being the case, he had recorded a letter to one of his loved ones that said, "With no Indians left to fight, I just might as well die anyway." So whether you conclude that Lewis Wetzel was a serial killer, an Indian terrorist, or perhaps even a frontier hero, one thing is sure, he had an extraordinary life, which was, of course, extraordinarily violent. It's difficult to judge people of Lewis's time by our standards today. In fact, one of the more interesting things about Lewis was, for all of the Indian murders that he's racked up, he actually was also a countless savior of many whites. When they were taken captive, Lewis was one of the first ones to go across the river and see if he could recapture white settlers that were now in the hands of Native Americans. He would also do the same thing for livestock and horses, because that was the lifeblood along the American frontier. Hero or villain, he was an extraordinarily brave man whose childhood likely formed the personality that's so legendary today. Right, wrong, or somewhere in the middle, the American frontier was won by people like Lewis Wetzel, Simon Kenton, and Simon Girty. The acts of these people sometimes were barbaric. We would probably even conclude somewhat psychopathic, but in the end, absolutely necessary. One of the things, however, that sets Lewis apart is he remained completely unrepentant about his behavior. Simon Kenton would later lament on a young brave that he killed with a tomahawk that he didn't really need to. I don't know if those people understood the concept of post-traumatic stress disorder back then, but I can tell you Lewis Wetzel didn't have it. And in my opinion, that's a trait worth admiring, kind of on its own. I hope you guys have enjoyed this story, and don't be afraid to like and subscribe.